go to the back to that table over there and just retrieve one of the prize giveaways. So, if you have your ticket, can I see you hold it in the air? Hold it in the air, yeah, hold it in the air. All right, ticket number. Our first one, 3672. Do I have a 3672 in the house? If not, I'll just go because I know there's quite a few people. You got one. All right. 3672. All right. Just go ahead and go to that table where Brother Craig is or where Brother Benjamin's at. All right. And go ahead and select your prize. All right. Here we go. All right. Ticket number 3603. 3603. I know there's some that were here last night. They're not here, so they may not be. All right, I'll just 3603. No? All right, next number. 3675. That's you. All right. Come on. 3675. Thank you so much. All right. Ticket number. See, this is one of my favorite parts of the event. You know, some people say don't give a preacher a microphone. Well, I guess sometimes a youth pastor can be worse as well. All right, so 3647. 3647. Do we have a ticket number 3647? Did I hear someone? No? 3647. All right, going on to the next one. How about ticket number 3685? Yeah, Miss Jenny. Awesome, perfect. Let me get one more. Yes, just go see Mr. Benjamin in the back. One more. So, what number should I call out? Okay. All right, here we go. 3678. Do I have a 3678 in the house? I want to say it one more time. 3678. All right, I guess I'm going to the other one because I want to give away the book. All right, here we go. How about 3698? 3698. All right, we got a winner. Awesome. You're welcome. Perfect. All right, let's give a round of applause for those who were blessed with a prize. Don't worry, this is not the first time we're doing this. Or the only time we're doing this. We're going to go ahead and do this later in between the breaks. Again, we have a small selection of spots available for the lunch. And if you, so we have two left. We have 2 spots left. So if you want to join us in the lunch, go see Miss Christina Marshall or one of the young ladies who are in the lobby. If you did not receive or forgotten your ticket, we give you permission to go grab another one, all right? Okay, so at this time, we are transitioning into session 2 of today and session 2 of Mr. Bill Federer. Are we excited for what he did last night and what he's going to do today? So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, Mr. Bill Federer.
Great. Thank you, Josue, and thank you all, and happy birthday to Pastor Russell. Yes, yes. What a great man. I'm so impressed with all the Lord is doing through you and Sylvia. You're an inspiration. And well, I do want to make another plug for Regent University. Drew's got the table over there, and it is a premier university. I've been on the board of trustees for about 20 years. And then a book called Miracles in American History. My wife and I put this together, stories from our country's past where there's a crisis, they pray and have courage, and things turn around. Well, I felt like in this session I would talk about something that's in the news. And it's Israel and Islam, and I get to go to countries and cities all around, and they tell me, I was in Sugar Land, Texas, and there's a large growing Muslim community there, and they're getting involved politically, and they're beginning to take over elections. And then there's EPIC, East Plano Islamic community. They want to build this big, huge development, and I go to cities around, and the same thing is happening. So we have to give a little history. Abraham and Isaac 1800 BC, are there in the Holy Land. Joshua enters with a couple million Jews, 1400 BC. David captures Jerusalem, 1000 BC. 10 northern tribes taken captive to Assyria, 722 BC. Babylon captures Judah, 587 BC. Babylon destroys the temple. Cyrus let the Jews go back, 539 BC. Alexander the Great conquers that whole area, and the general Seleucus takes over Persia, called the Seleucid Empire, and the Maccabees throw them off, and for a century, Judah has its own kingdom. It's completely independent, and then they have a civil war between the Sadducees and Pharisees. Pharisees mean student of the law, and that goes back to Ezra. When they came out of Babylon, Ezra had them teaching the law. But when Alexander the Great conquered, and he was a Greek secular guy, right? And you had the Sadducees wanting to kiss up to the Greeks, and they became more secular, and they viewed the religion with disdain. They didn't believe in resurrection or angels or prophets or any of that. And so there was a civil war between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And by this time, there's a Roman general named Pompey. And he's up in Cappadocia, the Black Sea, and he says, hey, civil war, perfect time to invade, which is actually the Soviet tactic throughout the Cold War. Is you sow division in the country and weaken it, and that's when you invade. And anyway, so Pompey comes down, sides with the Pharisees, who were the rural Jews, to conquer Jerusalem, and the Sadducees were the political ones, and they control the Temple Mount. And Pompey goes into the temple and sees it and turns around and comes out and tells his men, don't touch this place. And so, but from this point on, Judea is a Roman province. And so as the centuries go on, the decades go on, the Romans begin to grow more and more in power. Jesus' ministry, 30 to 33, he dies and rises from the dead, praise God. And then you have Pentecost, and the church spreads. And then you have, from this period, all of the Roman Empire in the next century or so becomes Christian. And then there's an interesting map where it shows the spread of Christianity throughout that whole area. And then you'll see it going all the way to India and Persia. And then around 570 AD, you have Islam. And it is very aggressive. And you'll see that in a minute here. There's the green. And there's Islam growing and begins to take over all that area. And then Christianity is the white, and it's spreading into Europe and spreading into Central Asia. And then there's the Mongols, Genghis Khan, and that's around 1200. And then Christianity is shrinking in certain areas, and Islam is growing, the green. And then we're going to come up to the New World, and it becomes Christian, all right, a lot of the Catholic missionaries, and then into the north. And then you have, in the early 1900s, communism. Boom. And it starts taking over all these areas. And anyway, that was fascinating, wasn't it? So Nero is the first one who started persecuting Christians, 64 AD, and then he has a general, Vespasian, who attacks Judah, and the Jews end up having a civil war against themselves. They sort of cornered off the city of Jerusalem, and they're fighting each other. Nero dies. Vespasian goes back to be the emperor, and his son Titus is the one who ends up conquering Jerusalem, 70 AD, and Titus destroys the city, scatters the Jews. About 1 million are killed, and they take all the treasures back to Rome. And then you have, they take the money from Israel to build the Colosseum. Did you know that? And then, when you do bad things to Israel, bad things happen to you. What happened to Rome? Mount Vesuvius blows up in 79 AD and kills lots of people, and then they end up having a plague. And then you get to 117, and you have Hadrian. And he builds the Hadrian Wall this far and no further, and then you have the Judea revolt called the Simon Bar Kokhba revolt, and Hadrian sends over a Roman legion, and it gets destroyed. This Simon Bar Kokhba had 400,000 Jews, and they attacked this Roman legion of 12,000 and wiped it out. Hadrian sends over another Roman legion, and it disappears from history. It's like totally gone. So Hadrian decides to send every Roman legion to Judea. And they attack and kill city after city. 500,000 killed the Battle of Beitar. And Hadrian executes the rabbis, burns every Torah he can find, prohibits the Hebrew calendar, kills as many descendants of David as he could find, builds a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount, renames the city Aelia Capitolina, and Aelia is Hadrian's family name. And then he renames Judea, Syria, Palestina. That's where you get the word Palestine. Where you're, oh, Palestine, Palestine, Palestinians. Palestine goes back to Hadrian. He's the one that changed the map because he wanted to wipe out the Jews. And so we have people say, well, the violent Muslims don't represent true Islam. Yet in many cases, they're yelling Allahu Akbar, and they think they do represent true Islam. So who can tell us what true Islam is? One person, Muhammad. He's the best Muslim that ever lived. His life is called the Sunnah, which means the way or the example. And his life went through 3 stages. He was a religious leader, a political leader, and a military leader. So the world before Muhammad was born, you have the Roman Empire has been completely Christianized, and it is facing Persia, which is Zoroastrian. And they have a war, sort of the Cold War between U.S. and USSR. Back then, it was the Byzantine Christian West and the Persian Zoroastrian East. They beat each other up and leave a power vacuum. And into that came Islam. So Muhammad's born in 570 A.D. His father dies before he's born. His mother dies when he's 6. His grandfather and guardian dies when he's 8. He's orphaned, taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, who's a merchant. And he takes Muhammad on camel rides to different cities. And he hears about the different religions. And so they go to Persia, and Muhammad hears about the Zoroastrian religion that believes that paradise is filled full of virgins that fulfills all the guy's desires. And the Zoroastrians believed in jinns or genies. Well, that got incorporated into his belief system. And then they went to pagan areas. The Sabaeans in Yemen, who believed in stoning the devil and walking around the Kaaba, and they had the calendar began with the first sight of the crescent moon over the desert. And they had this rock they thought had fallen from the moon. It's a glass impact rock where a meteor hit the desert sands. And these pagans would kiss this rock, bow to this rock, walk around this rock 5 times a day. They did this for centuries pre-Muhammad, and it got incorporated into Muhammad's belief system. And then the Zoroastrians, I mentioned them, the Manichaeism. Mani was someone who, a century or so before Muhammad, began to combine different beliefs from different religions. From his point of view, he was extracting the truth from these different religions. A follower of Manichaeism was the Apostle St. Augustine. St. Augustine decided to follow Manichaeism, and then he met the guy, realized he didn't know what he was talking about, and rejected it. And Augustine spent the rest of his life debunking Manichaeism. But this idea that you could combine little pieces of different faiths is something that was in the area that Muhammad lived. And Muhammad could not read, which was common for that area. So he never read the New Testament, never read the Old Testament, but he heard Jewish oral traditions called Talmud and Mishnah. And some of those stories got incorporated into his belief system. And so somebody said, well, if somebody can't read, how can they memorize all these verses? Well, in Arabic, they had a rhyme to them, a beat, very similar to rap music. So maybe there is somebody that can't read, but they can memorize these rap songs. So Thomas Carlyle wrote in Heroes Worship 1840, Arabs see more method in it than we. Much of it is rhythmic, a kind of wild chanting. And so the Quran means recitation. The word Quran means recitation because Muhammad and his original followers could not read. And so Muhammad didn't read the New Testament. He thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Nobody ever explained to him the Holy Spirit. And even Encyclopedia Britannica says the gospel was known to him, Muhammad, chiefly through apocryphal and heretical sources. And so floating through the area was the infancy gospel of Thomas, written a couple centuries after Jesus by someone who knew nothing of Jewish life. It has these fanciful stories of Jesus making clay birds and clapping, and they flew away, and a playmate fell off the roof of a house and died, and Jesus raised him from the dead. They're written with so many errors that no scholar has ever taken them serious. But these were floating around, and Muhammad heard them, and he incorporated them into his belief system, and now the Muslims take it as fact. And so he has his religion that has a little bit for everybody, and he thinks it's going to unite the world. 610 AD, he goes into Mecca, and he only makes 70 converts in 12 years, and he gets frustrated and confrontational, and they chase him out of town. He tries going to a city called Al-Taif. They don't want him. They pelt him with rocks and stones. So he goes to a city called Medina. Now, Medina is a Jewish city, 3 Jewish clans, and they're nice and tolerant, and they let Muhammad in as a Muslim immigrant, the first ever Muslim immigrant. And Muhammad presents his faith to the Jews, and they reject him. So he changes the direction of bowing from Jerusalem to Mecca. That's right. He originally had his followers bowing toward Jerusalem, but when the Jews rejected him, he changed the direction to Mecca. And so he goes into the minority neighborhoods, and he begins to organize a following amongst the pagans. And as they begin to convert, his following gets larger, and then he gets involved in politics. And he pressures the 3 Jewish clans into a treaty, and they agree. And so now Muhammad is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. We're familiar with community organizers, right? And then his followers in Mecca get confrontational. They get chased out of town. Now there is a lot of Muslim immigrants. And they come to Medina, and they're nice. Jews are nice and tolerant. They let them in and as Muslim refugees. And then Muhammad allows his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing him out of town. And so he becomes a military leader. The first is the Battle of Badra, 624 AD. The Meccans have 1,000 soldiers escorting their caravan. Muhammad, with 300, defeats 1,000. The Battle of Badra. And then he goes on to fight in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. The Battle of Uhud, expulsion of Banu Nadir, that was one of the Jewish clans. Banu Mystique, Battle of the Trench, 627 AD. What's that? So the raiding parties, here's a verse from the Hadith. When the messenger of Allah sent out a raiding party, he would say to them, make your raids in the name of Allah, in the way of Allah, fight whoever denies Allah, do not steal from the booty. Why? Because Muhammad got 1/5 of the booty. Here's another hadith. Muhammad said, the person who participates in the holy battles in Allah's cause will be recompensed by Allah either by a reward or booty if he survives, or will be admitted to paradise when he's killed. And Prophet, we've made lawful to you the slave girls who Allah has given you as booty. Whatever you take as spoils of war, lo, 1/5 thereof is for Allah and for the messenger. So Muhammad got 1/5 of the booty. You could come away with 4 wives plus as many extra women as your right hand possesses. They're just not the status of a wife. They're concubines and slave wives. And the Battle of the Trench. So Muhammad digs trenches and potholes all around the city of Medina. So when the Meccans send up 10,000 cavalry, you can't charge your horses and camels across a field full of potholes and trenches. They'll break their legs. Throws off the battle strategy. Muhammad goes to some of the Meccans at night, bribes them, they slip away. Goes to some of the other Meccans at night, threatens them, and they slip away, sort of the bribe or the bullet, right, the silver or the lead. And then it gets freezing cold for a week, and the rest of the Meccans lose heart and retreat. And Muhammad considers this a great victory that his enemies left. And so he goes back into the Jewish city of Medina, and he gets offended at one of the Jewish tribes. Let me see if I got that slide in here. Maybe not. He gets offended at one of the Jewish tribes, confiscates their property, chases them out of town. Now, the other two tribes sort of keep their heads low, think he's not looking at them. And now there's two Jewish tribes. He gets offended at one of those, confiscates their property, chases them out of town. And the big Jewish tribe sort of sits back, keeps its head low. Well, at least he's not picking on me. And then finally he's taken a bath, according to the Hadith, and a spirit appears to him and says, how can you rest when Allah's enemies are in your midst? And he says, where? In the thing points at the last Jewish neighborhood. Muhammad surrounds them for 28 days. When they surrender, he brings them into the market, chops off the heads of the men, sells the women and children into slavery. So within 5 years of Muhammad coming into the Jewish city of Medina as a refugee, there's not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved. And so this divide and conquer strategy has been used throughout history. If Muhammad would have said in 5 years there won't be a Jew left, those three clans would have made up with each other. But instead, he picks on the one. So he'll come in and side with one party and says, I'll help you against the other party. And they're like, really, really, you'll help us? Yeah. And then they come in, and then once they're in charge, they take over the whole thing. And so Muhammad's life goes from a religious leader to a political leader to a military leader. And it's RPM. Right? Like a revolution is permitted in your car. So there's freedom for all religions in America, but Islam is not just a religion, because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was also a political and a military leader. So the effort to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is you're trying to split Muhammad. And anyway, they did have movements throughout their history where some would try to be less violent, and then the violent ones would attack them. And they do something called victimhood, where Muhammad said, I'm the victim, you chased me out of Mecca, therefore I'm justified in attacking. So they always played the victim throughout history, right? They want to say, well, you're intolerant of us. So projection. Here's one of the verses in the Quran, cut off the hand of a thief. Here's another verse in the Quran, Surah 24:2. A woman who's been raped gets punished with 100 stripes for allowing herself to be used as a tool of Satan to tempt the man. So the women have to wear the burqas on purpose to look unattractive, because if they look attractive and they get raped, it's their fault and they get whipped for it. And so Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson writes in Law of the Middle East, Islamic law offers the American lawyer a study in dramatic contrast. Its striking feature relative to our law is not likenesses, but inconsistencies, not similarities, but contrarieties. The law of the Middle East is the antithesis of Western law. So in America, we punish the rapist, and in Islamic law, they punish the victim. And so Muhammad has two sets of verses in the Quran. The verses he gets in Medina, when he was a religious leader, they're just religious verses, and they're relatively more peaceful. The verses he gets in Medina are political and military verses, and they're more political and military and violent. And the later verses supersede or abrogate the early verses. For example, in the Bible, we have an Old Testament and a New Testament. Old Testament has some violence in it, Moses and Joshua wiping out tribes. New Testament, Jesus and the apostles never killed anybody. So what do we say? The last example is the one we're going to try to follow. It's the same way in Islam, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first when Muhammad was a religious leader in Mecca, and they're superseded by the later verses that are more military he gets in Medina. And so 627 AD is the Battle of the Trench. I already mentioned that, and he chops off the heads of the Jewish men and sells the women and children into slavery. So within 5 years of his death, every pre-existing culture in Arabia is wiped out. And so it's a three-step process. Like Caesar's 3 steps, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Islam's 3 steps is immigrate, increase, eliminate. Immigrate into a host country as a religious refugee, increase the number of your followers and get involved politically, and then have random outbreaks of violence, and the previous inhabitants of the community no longer feel safe, and they move out and they take over the community. very much like in nature, you have domestic species and invasive species. And so here's a news article. Member of the first U.S. majority Muslim city council in Hamtramck, Michigan warns, today we showed the Polish, because Hamtramck used to be a Polish city, but now they've taken over the city council, and they have their calls to prayer 5 times a day. And so there's a 1,400-year track record to watch this process happening. So there's no question as to what's happening in Europe and what's happening in communities in America. And the Islamic expansion went through 3 stages. The first was an Arab-Persian phase, 622 to 1071. And then there's a Turkish phase from 1071 to 1923 with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And then the current one that started in 1928 with the Muslim Brotherhood. And so their goal is a one world government called a caliph, a caliphate. And Muhammad had a sword, right? And so the Damascus steel was a brand new military invention. Instead of a forged sword that the Romans had, Damascus steel was this process where you'd heat it up, bend it over on itself, hammer it down, bend it over on itself, hammer it down. And each time you did that, it would get thinner and thinner and stronger. So it was like the weight of a razor blade. And then the stirrup. Romans and Greeks had horses and saddles, but their feet just sort of dangled. The stirrup was invented in India and Mongolia, where they would tie a rope around the horse, leave 2 loops hanging for your big toes, because they would ride barefoot. And that made its way to China, and then to Persia, across the Gobi Desert, and they made stirrups out of metal with leather straps. And this changed riding a horse from a transportation to a weapon. So you could put your feet in the stirrups, and you put the full power of a galloping horse behind your scimitar sword, and at a full gallop, they literally could slice somebody in half. It's the fastest thing on the battlefield. And so there's the U.S. Supreme Court chamber, Washington, D.C., has lawgivers throughout history. It does have Moses and the 10 Hebrew commandments, but it has Muhammad with his sword and his Arabic Quran, and that's on our U.S. Supreme Court building, Muhammad with a sword. And so there's his sword in a Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, Turkey. I've been there. You can see Muhammad's sword. They have a whole room full of swords. And so he had a general, Khalid ibn al-Walid. He was called the Drawn Sword of Allah, undefeated in 100 battles. And so within 23 years of Muhammad's death, the Muslims conquered Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom. They conquered Jerusalem, which had been a Byzantine Christian city for 3 centuries. They conquered Syria, which was the first country to completely be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria. And then the Muslims conquered Egypt, which was Christian, evangelized by Mark, that wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage. Today that's Tunisia. And then they invaded Spain. And they did the same thing. So there were different kingdoms in Spain that did not get along. And the Muslims would conquer one or kidnap the son of another king. And they would play off the disagreements that these different kingdoms had so that they could finally conquer the whole thing. When they conquered so quickly, they held back trade. And so one of the things traded was papyrus reeds from the Egyptian Nile Delta. And so paper, papyrus, there was a shortage of paper in Europe, so they wrote fewer books, and it's called the Dark Ages. And then the oldest library in the world was in Alexandria, Egypt. And supposedly they went to Caliph Umar and said, what do we do with all these books? And his answer was, every book that does not agree with the Quran, destroy. And every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant because we have the Quran. So destroy them all. It took 6 months to burn them all. And then they invaded Spain, and then they were stopped at the Battle of Tours, and then Charles Martel, then they attacked Constantinople, and they were stopped because the Greeks had Greek fire, where you'd take oil and sawdust and put it in a cannon and then shoot it past a torch, and it would catch on fire like napalm. And so the word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah, and Islam believes there will be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So it is a religion of peace. It's just their definition of the word peace is different than ours. Our definition of peace is different groups getting along. To them, world peace means world Islam, right? So, one word having two meanings. Lincoln, during the Civil War, said, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing, right? When the South said liberty, it was kicking the North out. When the North said liberty, it was freeing the slaves. So in Islam, the world's divided in two. The half that has submitted and the half that's in the process of submitting. It's called the House of Islam, the House of Submission, and the Dar al-Harb, the House of War. The non-Muslim world is supposed to be at war because it's in the process of being submitted. And a moderate Muslim believes the world will submit to Allah later, maybe in the distant future, maybe at the end of the world. And it's so far off, they really don't think about it, and they just want to live their lives, and they're very happy to have you as a friend and a neighbor. The fundamental Muslim thinks the world is supposed to submit to Allah now, and they're really excited and want to help make it happen. The dilemma for the West is the nicer we show ourselves in foreign policy, the fundamentalist Muslims view that niceness as weakness, and they take that as an invitation to attack. So the law of the jungle is weakness invites aggression. It's like lions chasing the zebra, and there's one zebra that's limping. Which one is the lion gonna jump on? The weak one. And so when they sense weakness, so whenever the West would win major battles, Battle of Lepanto, Battle of Tours, the Muslim powers would retreat and go into remission and become less violent for a couple of decades, a couple of generations. But then they would do preemptive strikes, and if there was no strong response, they would take that as an invitation to become more aggressive. Here's an interview with psychologist Nikolai Sen. Muslims instinctively see our lack of reaction as fear and invitation to attack. So another word defined is innocent. In Islam, it's wrong to kill the innocent. Well, who's innocent? It says, Allah loveth not those who reject the faith. Be ruthless to the infidel, Surah 48:29. Make war on the infidel, the unbeliever. Fight those who believe not in Allah. Kill the disbeliever wherever we find them. So when they say it's wrong to kill the innocent, it's code for it's wrong to kill a faithful Muslim. Now, the fundamentalist, what are called Islamist Muslims, they're more than happy to kill a moderate Muslim as they are to kill an infidel, because they view the moderate Muslims as having departed from the way of Allah. So the moderate ones are sort of in the middle. And it's sort of like when the West shows itself strong, then the moderate ones are emboldened to be friends with the West. It's sort of like if a drug gang is moving into your neighborhood and you see them doing a drug deal on your front lawn and you call the police show up and arrest them. Are you going to keep calling the police? Well, yeah. But what if you call the police and they don't show up? Worse, the gang leader comes to your door and says, we have somebody inside the police department that said you called on us, and if you do it again, we'll kill you. Are you going to call the police anymore? No. Right? And so now it's Muhammad had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives, slave wives, concubines. His youngest was Aisha, the 6-year-old. And anyway, and so the father of Aisha is Abu Bakr, and he was with Muhammad in every battle. And so he said he knew the way, and so the word for the way is Sunni. And so, but Muhammad had a daughter Fatima, married to Ali, and the followers of Ali are called Shi'ali or Shiite. And so 10% of Muslims are Shiite, and they go back to Muhammad's son-in-law Ali, and around 90%, give or take, there's a couple different small sects in Islam, but the majority are Sunni, and they go back to Muhammad's father-in-law, Abu Bakr. And so the moderate ones are happy to live in a country and abide by the laws. But the fundamentalist ones want to overthrow the laws. So here's a Joram Choudary, Islam for UK, And he said, "We've had enough of democracy and man-made law. We call for a complete upheaval of the British ruling system and demand full implementation of Sharia in Britain." And so what's Sharia? It's trying to be like Muhammad. So Muhammad was the best Muslim, right? And Christians want to be like Jesus. Muslims want to be like Muhammad. Except Christians do not believe you go to heaven by being like Jesus. You go to heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for your sins. And you're so happy you want to live like Jesus and show the world how much he loves them. But in Islam, their thought of going to paradise is proportional to how closely they can follow Muhammad's example. And so so what Muhammad permitted is permitted. It's called halal. And what Muhammad did not permit is not permitted. It is called haram. So Islam is a long list of do's and don'ts. What's permitted, what's not. So Muhammad liked cats. Cats are halal. They are permitted. Muhammad did not like dogs. Dogs are haram. They are not permitted. And so in Islam, the local imam keeps the list. And the people come up and says, "Is this permitted?" "Yes, yes, that's halal." "Is this permitted?" "No, no, no, that's haram." "Well, why is it haram?" "I can't tell you." "Well, I really want to know." "Well, if you ask again, I'll kill you, because if you're asking too many questions, you're doubting Islam, and if you doubt Islam, you get killed." And so it's not a religion of understanding, it's just obeying. So Sharia comes from four sources. First is the Quran, private revelations to Muhammad in the city of Mecca, and then the city of Medina. And then there's the Hadith. There's 60,000 stories remembered about Muhammad from his wives and warriors. There's the Surat, which is his biography, compiled 100 years after his death. And then there's hundreds of years of rulings, and they fall into four different categories of imams interpreting the Quran, the Hadith, and the Surat. And they had slavery. Muhammad owned slaves. Muhammad was a white Arab. There are hadiths that said that when he lifted his arms to pray, they'd see the whiteness of his armpits. Another hadith, the guy's donkey rubbed up against him, and he said, "I saw the whiteness of the prophet's thigh." Another hadith says that people came to see Muhammad, and they said he's the white man reclining on the couch. And Muhammad owned black slaves, like Bilal. And so Islam is credited for enslaving millions of Africans, and then they captured Europeans from Italian cities and coast of France and Greece. And so there were Catholic orders in Europe called Trinitarians who would ransom back your friend, right? They captured an entire Irish city in the 1600s, Baltimore, Ireland. Muslim pirates came up at nighttime, rounded up the whole town, took them to Morocco and sold them into slavery. And and then they sold them to the European slave traders that brought them to the New World. They'd take the boys from the Christian families and turn them into Muslim soldiers to attack the next Christian city. And if the boys were cute, they put them into their pederasty. I won't go into that. Even David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary to the Congo, writes about going through an area, and then a couple years later, it's all ghost villages. The Muslim slave traders came through, depopulated it. He said one time he saw a trail of hundreds of Africans shackled together, being forced to march hundreds of miles to the coast to be sold into Arab slave trade. And if they walked too slow, they would just shoot them and tie them to a tree, and the vultures. He said you could tell the trails by looking where the vultures were. And it still goes on today. Slave trade in Niger, married to Timbuktu, where the canoe meets the caravan, and southern Sudan, and all these different places where the Arab Muslims take the Christian Muslims. Now, after the Muslims had advanced and they were stopped at the Battle of Tours in France, they were stopped at Constantinople, they became a little more moderate. And you had Muslim scholars. It's called the Islamic Golden Age. And they were studying geometry and philosophy. And so here's Al-Farabi, and he's studying science, and Avicenna, and he's studying Aristotle and medicine and math, and Veros, he's studying music and all this. And if you would have took a snapshot, you would have thought the world was about to experience the Renaissance. The Arab world was going to have the Renaissance. But it gets slapped down by this Muslim scholar, Ghazali. He's a mujahideen, a renewer of the faith, the second most influential Muslim after Muhammad. And he said, stop studying Greek stuff. He even said this: one should restrain anyone who would immerse himself in these mathematical sciences. For even though they do not pertain to the domain of religion, yet since they are among the foundations of the philosopher's sciences, the student will be infected with the evil and corruption of the philosophers. So he said, don't even study Greek geometry. Just study the Quran. Well, what happened? There's a closing of the Islamic mind, while at the same time, Europe had St. Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism. He said, it's okay to read Greek stuff. Eat the hay, spit out the sticks type of thing. And so Europe was open to the Renaissance. What about the Crusades? And so before I get into that, the largest religion in the world is Christianity, about 31, 32%. Second largest religion in the world is Islam, and then followed by unaffiliated Hindus, Buddhists, and then 0.2% Jew. So let's compare the founders of the two largest religions in the world. Jesus never killed anybody. Muhammad killed an estimated 3,000 people. Jesus never led armies. Muhammad led armies. Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad owned slaves. Jesus never married. Muhammad had 11 to 22 wives. And Jesus never tortured anyone. Muhammad captured the chief of Khaybar, and he wouldn't tell where the treasure was hidden, so he stretched him on the ground and kindled a fire on his chest. Jesus did not lie. Muhammad permitted lying. It's called taqiyya, where you can lie to your enemy. And Jesus never forced anyone to follow him. And he multiplied loaves and fishes, had a crowd following him for a free lunch, and he said something difficult, and they walked with him no more. He didn't run after him with a sword, say, get back here. And Muhammad said, whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him. Jesus never avenged insults. They're mocking him, and he says, Father, forgive him. Muhammad avenged insults. There were a guy with slave girls, and they made up poems making fun of Muhammad. When Muhammad conquered Mecca, he ordered them murdered. Jesus did not permit his disciples to rape anyone. Duh. Muhammad did, and there's all these hadiths that talk about it. And none of the apostles were governors or generals. Every one of the caliphs was a governor and a general. Jesus taught God was our Father. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call Allah your Father. Jesus taught we're children of God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call yourself a child of Allah, because Allah took no wife and has no son. Jesus taught we're made in the image of God. In Islam, Allah has no image. Jesus taught to have a personal relationship with God. John 17, and this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah. He is forever unknowable. Even in the next life, you'll never meet him. The first 3 centuries of Christianity, there were 10 major persecutions. Christians were thrown to the lions. They never led an armed resistance against the Roman emperor. The first 3 centuries of Islam, they conquered from Arabia to Tours, Paris. And so Jesus said, if they don't accept your message, shake the dust from your feet and leave. Muhammad, if they don't accept your message, wage war on the town. And now this is a verse that a friend of mine has a ministry to Muslims, and this is one they have no counter for. Isaiah 61, Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted. There's no concept in all of Islam that Allah wants to heal your broken heart. Allah could care less about your broken heart. Allah demands submission. And so when you tell a Muslim that God loves you and he cares about you and he wants to, and I've prayed with Muslims and they feel the presence of the Lord and they're like, what happened? You know, because they feel that love. And so then the Vikings convert to Christianity, and Richard the Norman comes and captures Sicily and southern Italy from the Muslims. And then it takes 700 years to drive the Muslims out of Spain. All right, Charlton Heston, El Cid, and then the Muslims conquer into the Byzantine Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by Muslim Turks. Ephesus and Thyatira and Sardis and Pergamum and all gone. And then the Muslims conquered Constantinople, cutting off the land routes to India, and that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route. The most popular Greek saint was St. Nicholas, He gave to the poor during Roman times. And when the Muslims invaded, they moved his bones over to Italy. And then you had the Greek Christians begging the West for help. The West sent help. It's called the Crusades. Right? 9 major crusades over 200 years. When the Crusades, Richard the Lionheart led the 3rd Crusade. St. Louis, I was born in St. Louis. He led the 7th and 8th Crusades. When the Crusades end, the Muslims pick up where they left off. They invade into Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, a Muslim leader, Tamerlane, kills 17 million across Central Asia. And then they conquer Constantinople, 1450. And that's when Columbus sets sail looking for a sea route to India and China because the Muslims cut off the land routes. Columbus would have never set sail had it not been for Islam conquering Constantinople in 1453. And now, as they're conquering into Greece, the Greek scholars are fleeing west, and this is called the Renaissance. And they're bringing their Greek art and literature into Western Europe and their Greek New Testaments. And so scholar Erasmus is translating the Bible not just from Latin, but from Greek, and his friend is Martin Luther, starts the Reformation. And 1529, you have 100,000 Muslims surrounding Vienna. Martin Luther says, the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. And John Calvin, I hear the sad condition of your Germany. The Turk again prepares to wage war with a larger force. John Wesley, ever since the religion of Islam appeared in the world, the espousers of it have been as wolves and tigers to all other nations, rending and tearing all that fell into their merciless paws. And even Thomas Aquinas, Muhammad seduced the people with promises of carnal pleasure. Those who believed in him were brutal men, desert wanderers. Muhammad forced others to become his followers through the violence of his arms. France makes a treaty with the Ottoman Empire against Spain, and for the next 3 centuries, you have France arming and training the Muslim Turks to fight Spain and the rest of Europe. And so the Muslim leader, Suleiman the Magnificent, attacks Vienna, Austria, and then you have Muslim pirates in the Mediterranean, and then the Muslims are stopped in several battles, and they had slavery. St. Vincent de Paul was captured by the Muslims, and he escaped, and then he started a ministry to ransom back slaves and also started hospitals. Captain John Smith had founded Virginia. Spent 5 years fighting the Muslims over in Hungary in the Long War. And he was captured and made a slave. And when, by the way, he was in some hand-to-hand combat, and he was able to chop off the heads of 3 Muslims, and so he got a coat of arms with 3 heads with turbans on them. And but he's captured and made a slave. And one day his slave master's beating him. Nobody's around. He kills his slave master, dresses himself in the slave master's clothes, and then escapes to Russia, and then makes his way back to Europe, and then he fights the Muslims on the Mediterranean Sea. And then in 1605, he goes back to England, and then in 1606, he sets sail to found Virginia. This is the historical marker there at Jamestown. It says, John Smith was born in 1580, son of a yeoman farmer. As a young man, he traveled throughout Europe and fought as a soldier in the Netherlands and in Hungary. Well, who did he fight in Hungary? It was the Muslim Turks. Was captured, taken to Turkey, sold into slavery, and then in Russia, and then murdered his master, escaped back to Hungary, collect the promised reward. That's when he's given the coat of arms, returned to England, participated in the settlement of Virginia. How many of you knew that? And then the Pilgrims, they save up 800 pounds of beaver skins, and they're sending it back to England in 1625, and a Muslim Turkish man of war captures it in the English Channel and takes them to captive into to Morocco. 1683, you have 200,000 Muslims surrounding Vienna. Same year, William Penn is founding Pennsylvania. And the King of Poland, Jan Sobieski, comes to the rescue on September 11th, 1683. And he has the largest cavalry charge in history up to this point. Well, Sobieski goes into the abandoned Muslim camps and finds these bags of beans. And they were coffee beans. And the word coffee comes from the word kafir, which means infidel. So coffee beans came from Ethiopia, the one African country to stay Christian. So the Muslims called the Christians in Ethiopia kafirs, which means infidels, and so they called it the kafir bean, the infidel bean. And they weren't sure if they should drink it, so they took a cup of it to Pope Clement. And he said, this is too good to leave for the Muslims, let's baptize it. And then coffee spread across Europe. So have you had your cup of infidel today? But it's okay to drink, Pope Clement said so. And then they were attacking Vienna, tunneling under the walls, and the baker was up early, and he heard the noise, told the soldiers they put buckets of water out so they could triangulate, see where they were digging, and then they dig a tunnel to intercept it, and they stopped the Muslims, and afterwards they were going to reward the baker, and he said, I don't need a reward, just give me the sole permission to cook a pastry in the shape of the Muslim crescent to celebrate our victory, and it's called a croissant. So the next time you have coffee and croissants, you can celebrate the Battle of Vienna, September 11, 1683. From that point on, the Ottoman Empire began to shrink. And then Napoleon invades Egypt, and then they have the Muslim pirates would capture ships, and the European countries would pay an annual tribute to the Muslims to leave their country's ships alone. And when America broke from Britain, America was no longer covered by the British tribute payment. So the day after Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated, our third president, he gets a demand from the Pasha of Tripoli for $250,000 extortion tribute payment. And Jefferson said, I did the only reasonable thing. I sent in our Navy and our Marines, right? And so it's called the Barbary Pirate Wars. And anyway, this is all in a book that we put together. Stephen Decatur and the Star-Spangled Banner, it was written 9 years earlier to celebrate the victory of the Barbary Pirate War. And Francis Scott Key wrote, in conflict resistless, each toil they endured, till their foes shrunk dismayed from the war's desolation. Pale beamed the crescent, its splendor obscured by the light of the star-spangled flag of our nation, where each flaming star gleamed a meteor war, and the turbaned head bowed to the terrible glare. Then mixed with the olive, the laurel shall wave, and form a bright wreath for the brow of the brave. He wrote that 9 years before he reworded it and during the War of 1812 to be our Star-Spangled Banner. And anyway, John Paul Jones fights the Muslims on the Black Sea, where Crimea is today. And so you have the Ottoman Empire is collapsing. It's called the sick man of Europe. Mark Twain visits Palestine, sees it's all rags and rocks and everything's dying. And so the European powers begin to encroach on what's left of the Ottoman Empire. And Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and a bunch of Armenians want to break away, and he kills 100,000 of them. And then the Ottoman Empire was headed for collapse until oil. So in the 1800s, oil came from where? Wales. And then in 1859, you have oil discovered in Pennsylvania, and then in Oklahoma, and then in the Middle East. And so Winston Churchill changes the British Navy from coal to oil and forms the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1908. You know it better as BP. British Petroleum is the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and they're taking down the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company sign, putting up the British Petroleum sign. And then Germany needs oil, and so they do a treaty with the Turks and the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad, and half of World War I takes place in the Middle East. And then meanwhile, the Muslims kill a couple million Armenians. And so they redraw the map of Europe after World War I, but they also redraw the map of the Middle East. And so, is this interesting? And so you have a Russian Jew that immigrated to England. He's a chemist, and the British are running short of explosives. And so his name's Chaim Weizmann. He comes up with a bacterial fermentation process to make acetone needed for explosives. And so after the war, the British want to thank him, and they issue the Balfour Declaration. And that's the British giving the land that was taken from the Ottoman Empire to the Jews. And the land that they were given is the same dimensions as what God promised Moses. Now, where did the Jews get the idea of going back to their Holy Land? It came from Christians. It's called the Second Great Awakening Revival. And you had preachers called millennialists that discovered in the Bible that Jesus is going to come back and rule and reign for 1,000 years. And they said, for these prophecies to come true, the Jews need to be back there in the promised land. So you literally had Christians going to Jewish synagogues, telling them, you need to start thinking about going back. Jeffrey Alderman, Jewish Chronicle, 2012, writes, the Balfour Declaration was born out of religious sentiment. Arthur Balfour, British Foreign Secretary, was a Christian mystic who believed that the Almighty had chosen him to be a humble instrument, of divine will, the purpose of which was to restore the Jews to their ancient homeland, perhaps as a precursor to the second coming of the Messiah. And the declaration, Balfour Declaration, was thus intended as fulfillment of biblical prophecy. This appealed to Lloyd George, British Prime Minister, believing that the prophecies of the Bible he knew inside and out. So Christians are responsible for Israel even thinking about going back to their land. And you had Anita Shapiro writes, Israel a History, 2014, the idea of Jews returning to their ancient homeland is the first step to world redemption. Seems to have originated among a specific group of evangelical English Protestants that flourished in England in the 1840s, and they passed this notion on to Jewish circles. And so a Jew that caught the vision was Theodor Herzl. He organizes the first Zionist Congress in 1897. Somebody that attended was Henry Dunant, the head of the Geneva YMCA, who started the International Red Cross. And so he attended the Jews. The Lord Balfour, my personal hope is Jews will make good in Palestine, eventually found a Jewish state. And so the land they gave was all this, Syria down to Arabia, Iraq, Egypt. Then somebody throws a monkey wrench in the works, Lawrence of Arabia. Who's he? A British lieutenant stationed in Cairo, sent on an assignment, see if the Arab Muslims would help the British defeat the Turkish Muslims. And rather than just report back, he takes it upon himself to promise the Arab Muslims, if they help the British defeat the Turkish Muslims, they will get all the land in the Middle East. Now the land is promised to two different groups. And so Lawrence Arabia admitted that he knew he was lying. He writes in his Pillars of Wisdom, 1922, had I been an honest advisor to the Arabs, I would have advised them to go home and not risk their lives fighting for such stuff. I risked the fraud on my conviction that Arab help was necessary to our cheap and speedy victory in the East, and better we win and then break our word than lose. For being a successful trickster and to prevent this unpleasantness arising, I began in my reports to conceal the true stories of things. So he's lying to the British authorities, and then he's lying to the Arabs. After the war, Winston Churchill goes over there, and he thinks it's all going to be the Jews, and all of a sudden these Arabs are like, no, this is our land. And he's like, what? And so Winston Churchill says, okay, let's try to fix this mess. He takes the son of the Sharif of Mecca, named Fazl, and he makes him king of Iraq. And that's a new country carved out of the old Ottoman Empire. And this guy, the Sharif of Mecca, is relatively moderate. Lawrence of Arabia called him a modernist. And when the Armenians were being killed, he says, protect and take care of the Jacobite Armenian community. Defend them as you would defend yourselves. They're the protected people of the Muslims. And so he was wanting to protect these Armenians. And Fazl is now the king of Iraq. He thought he was going to be king of Syria too. And Alec Guinness played Fazl in the movie. Remember that movie? Peter O'Toole. But in real life, here's Chaim Weizmann with Fazl. They were getting along, the king of Iraq and the Jews. And Fazl says, we feel Arabs and Jews are cousins and having suffered similar oppressions at the hands of power stronger than themselves. We look with sympathy on the Zionist movement. We wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. And then the Sharif of Mecca says the resources of the country are still virgin soil developed by the Jewish immigrants. It is for its original sons, sacred beloved homeland. And he got assassinated and he died put on the Temple Mount. Anyway, so the land that the Jews were given was 2/3 were taken away. What happened? Abdullah's the brother of Fazl. Abdullah thought that Fazl should have gotten Syria and Iraq. But in one of the treaties, France was given protectorate of Syria. And the French come in and drive out all the Arabs. And so Abdullah is starting a second war to get the Arabs to fight the French. And Winston Churchill steps in and says, no, guys, the French are our friends. They fought with us against the Germans, right? And so Winston Churchill is having lunch in Cairo, and he pulls out a napkin, and he draws the British mandate, and he takes 2/3 of it with his pen, and he creates a brand new country called Transjordan across the Jordan River. And in the middle of it, there's like this jerk, and it's like, why in the world is there that jerk? And it's called Churchill's Hiccup, because he was known for drinking a little brandy with his lunches, and he like jerked and drew the map different. But it says he drew the map on a napkin at lunch with one stroke of a pen one Sunday afternoon in Cairo. And then later Churchill says, the Emir Abdullah is in Transjordan, the king, where I put him one Sunday afternoon in Jerusalem. So Churchill created this country of Jordan, takes Abdullah, the second son of Fazl, the Sharif of Mecca. And anyway, so now you have this Sharif of Mecca who worked with Lawrence of Arabia and believed those lies and promises. But his son Fazl's king of Iraq, his son Abdullah's king of Jordan. And Abdullah even liked the Jews. He says, no people on earth have been less anti-Semitic than Arabs. The persecution of the Jews has been confined almost entirely to Christian nations of the West, right? Spanish Inquisition and then the Holocaust. Jews themselves will admit that never since the Great Dispersion did Jews develop so freely and reach such importance as in Spain when it was an Arab possession. With very minor exceptions, Jews have lived for many centuries in the Middle East in complete peace and friendliness with their Arab neighbors. So what happened? You got secular leaders in Turkey, Ataturk, and there's Fazl. So here's Ataturk of Turkey wanting to secularize his country, Fazl wanting to have a secular Iraq separate from the Ottoman Empire and fundamentalism. Here's Ataturk of Turkey with the Shah of Iran, and he wanted to make Iran more secular, let women get educations, let women wear new fashions. Here's the Ataturk dressed in Western clothes with the king of Afghanistan, and he's wanting to modernize it and give women freedom. In Turkey, Ataturk said he is a weak ruler who needs religion to uphold his government. Even before accepting the religion of the Arabs, the Turks were a great nation. Mohammedanism was based on Arab nationalism above all nationalities. The purpose of the religion founded by Muhammad over all nations was to drag them into including Arab national politics. It might have suited tribes in the desert. It is no good for a modern progressive state. So Ataturk wanted to get rid of the fezzes and the burqas and the calls to prayer, made the weekend Saturday and Sunday rather than Friday, and gave women freedom. And Kennedy even honored Kemal Ataturk. And so what happened in Iran? Iran had this secular leader, the Shah. But when World War II starts, he did not drive out the Germans. And so Britain and the Soviet Union invade Iran, overthrow the Shah, put in a guy named Mossadegh. And Mossadegh decides he wants to nationalize, take over the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And so Britain is like, uh-oh, we need oil. And so Britain appeals to Eisenhower for help. And Eisenhower does Operation Ajax, where he sends in Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, to Iran with the CIA to overthrow Mossadegh and to put in the Shah's son. And the Shah's son loved America. Iran loved America. And he meets with Truman. He meets with the Kennedys. the Shah opens up their country to freedom. He even gets together with General Motors, and they build the Seville car. The Cadillac Seville was built in Iran. And so he was like moving in this direction. And then you had Kabul, Afghanistan, girls in skirts going to school, Syria having beauty pageants. Farouk in Egypt begins to lean toward the Soviet Union, so the CIA, Project FF, overthrows him, puts in Gamal Nasser, but he doesn't like the Jews, but he likes freedom in the West, and so Egypt has these different freedoms, looks like Southern California, and Nasser, I met with the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, he made his request. What did he request? Wearing the hijab mandatory in Egypt. I told him my opinion, every person in his own house decides the rules. He said, no, you're the leader. And he says, you have a daughter in the School of Medicine. She's not wearing a tarha. If you're unable to make one girl who's your daughter wear the tarha, you want me to put a tarha on 10 million women myself? So what happened? How do we go from Iran, loving America, to hating it? You got this video of the same thing I just showed you, but shows this. People forget this period, 50s, 60s, 70s. You had the Middle East loving America and wanting to be westernized, and then it gets all so what happened? Remember the Sharif of Mecca, who one son the British made king of Iraq, another son he made king of Jordan. The British wanted to twist his arm to agree to a treaty, and he waffles. And the British stand back and says, you know what? We're going to let Aziz ibn Saud take over Arabia. We're done with playing with you. And the Sauds are Wahhabi. They're radical Islamists. And they take over. Even Lawrence of Arabia says, Wahhabis, followers of a fanatical Muslim heresy, imposed their strict rules. Everything was forcibly pious, forcibly puritanical. Williams McCants. Saudis promote a very toxic form of Islam, sharp lines between a number of true believers and everyone else, Muslim and non-Muslim. So that's where the fundamentalist Muslims want to kill the moderates Muslims. And so it's not a hardware problem, it's a software problem. We love the person, we just don't like this Wahhabi teaching. And Wahhabism is what spurned every terrorist organization, right? And then oil's discovered by Standard Oil Company in Arabia in 1938. And so now the Wahhabism it's got money to spread. And so the Wahhabi teaching gave birth to all these terrorist groups. And then the Saudi oil funds it all. But Palestine still was the homeland for the Jews. This was a 1925-26 United Palestine Appeal, land of Jewish immigration. FDR writes to Stephen Wise, and he says, I'm pleased to support the Jews renew their Palestinian homeland. And then the British waffled on Israel. Right? So they had the Balfour Declaration in 1970, but now in 1922 they do the White Papers. And they say no more Jews can go back there. And so now the Jews, you see the movie with Paul Newman, like his first big movie, and it's called Exodus, and it's the British trying to stop the Jews from going back. But then 1928 the Muslim Brotherhood is started, and it takes the Wahhabi teaching and turns it into a blueprint plan. And it's based on the two cities Muhammad lived in, Mecca and Medina. So in Mecca, Muhammad was a religious leader. Remember I talked about that? In the Medina, Muhammad becomes a political and a military leader. So the Muslim Brotherhood said, all the Muslim immigrants go into host countries as religious refugees. And then once you're entrenched, you flip and become a political and militant Muslim and take over. And so they would infiltrate these countries and assassinate leaders. And you had the Mufti of Jerusalem, right, teaming up with Hitler, and so FDR meets with Aziz ibn Saud on the USS Quincy and does an arms for oil agreement. If Arabia will give America oil, we'll send a military base over there. And Anyway, then Truman becomes president, and Truman recognizes Israel, and the Democrat Party platform was President Truman by gaining immediate recognition to Israel, right? We affirm the state of Israel, right, of self-defense. But then immediately Israel is attacked. It's called the First Arab-Israeli War, 1948-49, and it's negotiated a peace with Ralph Bunche, the first African-American to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And then Abdullah gets assassinated by a Palestinian terrorist on the Temple Mount. Bad guy. And then in 1955, the fundamentalist Muslims stir up a riot in Turkey, and they attack the Christian neighborhoods. And Gamal Nasser, even though he's westernized, he doesn't like Jews. He seizes the Suez Canal, stops Israeli shipping. And so Israel responds and captures the Sinai. And Eisenhower talks him into giving it back, land for peace. The Soviets create the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO was started in the Soviet Union. After World War II, countries in Europe, Egypt, India wanted to be free, and they would start republics, but the Soviets didn't like that, so they would send in KGB to do what's called critical theory, where you'd observe all the groups in the country and categorize them. Ethnic groups, racial groups, Bosnians, Croats, Serbs, religious groups, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, doesn't matter, and they would pit them against each other, victims and oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they would stir up protests and riots and bloodshed. Why bloodshed? Because then people think emotionally and not logically, and then they want to blame somebody, and then they co-opt the media to channel all that blame against the leader of the country, and when his popularity falls, they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. So country after country would fall. It's called Behind the Iron Curtain. And so the Soviets created the PLO in Moscow for the sole purpose of keeping the Middle East from siding with the West. And they got Yasser Arafat to be the leader of it, and Yasser Arafat's with the communists in Cuba, right? And then the KGB and starting FARC in Colombia and ELN in Bolivia, and they do that divide and conquer. Meanwhile, the Muslim Brotherhood is now getting Soviet tactics. And the leader, Saeed Khattab, he tries to kill Nasser, and then he influences Khomeini and al-Zawahiri and all these other terrorists. Six-Day War, 1967. You have Jews are all attacked, but they win miraculously, and they take back the Temple Mount. You can see the Jewish flag on top of it. But Moshe Dayan, the general, tells him to take it down. Here is Nixon with Golda Meir. She was a Jew raised in Milwaukee, and she goes over, becomes a prime minister. And she says in 1969, there was no such thing as Palestinians. When was there an independent Palestinian people with a Palestinian state? It was either southern Syria, part of the Ottoman Empire, before the First World War, and then it was Jordan after Winston Churchill. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself a Palestinian people, and we came in and threw them out and took their country. They did not exist. It wasn't until the Soviet Union created the PLO that you had a Palestinian. And so you had 1972, Jews are killed by these fundamentalist Muslims at the Olympics. 1973 war, the Jews are all attacked. Carter does the Camp David Accords between Menachem Begin of Israel and Anwar Sadat of Egypt. And Billy Graham is praising Anwar Sadat for having the courage to stand up to the fundamentalist Muslims and become friends with the West. Pat Robertson praised Anwar Sadat for taking the courage, but the Muslim Brotherhood, who infiltrated the Egyptian military, they're having a parade, and they stop and they spray machine gun bullets and kill Anwar Sadat. Mubarak is wounded, but he comes back as the president, and he's in until Obama. And Obama goes over to Egypt and disinvites Mubarak and all the friends, and he fills the room with Muslim Brotherhood people. It's called the Arab Spring. And then what about Iran? Remember how the Shah loved America? Well, Jimmy Carter decides to pull the rug out of the Shah and bring in the Ayatollah. And so whenever you see Iran's terrible and they're starting the Hezbollah in Lebanon and they're feeding money to the Hamas and Iran is giving money to the Houthis and Iran got missiles and Iran this and that, think Jimmy Carter. Because prior to Jimmy Carter, Iran was our friend. And so Lebanon, 1983, Muslims blow up a Marine barrack, killing 241 U.S. Marines. I love Reagan, but the response was to pull out. And weakness invites aggression. So they're like, man, America, we thought they were tough. They just blow up one bomb and they leave. And then Afghanistan. There was a Soviet-Afghan war. And so the CIA is arming and training the Taliban to fight the Soviets. It was here's Reagan meeting with the Taliban. And here's Tom Hanks does a movie on it called Charlie Wilson's War. It's the largest covert CIA operation. What's covert mean? That means nobody in America knows about it. But our CIA is arming it. And even Sylvester Stallone did a movie on it called Rambo 3. And who was one of the Taliban that we trained? Osama bin Laden. And then you have the Iran-Iraq war. Iran is now Ayatollah, thanks to Jimmy Carter, and we don't want them to win. So America is arming and training Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis to fight the Iranians. And it's called Operation Praying Mantis. And then it flips, and we have the Iraq War, and then Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky fires some missiles over there, and he in Serbia, and he does Operation Deliberate Force. So Clinton is funneling arms through Iran to the Bosnian Muslims to fight the Serbian Christians. And Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman do a movie on it called Wag the Dog. The president's running for re-election involved in a sexual scandal, and they hire a Hollywood producer to create a war that they could put on TV in Albania. And then, anyway, most military strategists say that there undeniably would be no ISIS if we had not invaded Iraq. Military. If it's an authoritarian country, you just get rid of the king and you put in your guy, your puppet guy. You leave the whole structure in place. Even the Bible, Josiah's son Jehoahaz was the king. Egypt conquers, gets rid of Jehoahaz, and puts in Jehoiakim and says, okay, pay us tribute. But you don't go in and get the entire structure, get rid of the government, get rid of the military, get rid of everything, and it's just run by gangs. And the gang that arose out of that was called ISIS. And then under Obama, we let ISIS kill all these Christian minorities, called the genocide. And so this, I screenshotted this. Los Angeles Times: in Syria, militias armed by the Pentagon fight those armed by the CIA. Right? They want to get rid of and so we're funneling arms from Libya to Syria, and they even got docs show weapons going from Benghazi to Syria. Tulsi Gabbard went over there and she says, we're arming the terrorist groups. And so she introduces a bill called Stop Arming Terrorists Act. And then Trump gets in and he ends covert plan to arm these Syrian rebels. And then Trump acknowledges Jerusalem as the capital. Biden abandons Afghanistan, 20 years of our men and women fighting, and it's all given back to the Taliban. And I had an Uber driver one time, and he says, I'm a Black Hawk helicopter pilot, and I was working with the Americans in Afghanistan, and we could have taken out the Taliban so easily. They had pickup trucks and motorcycles, and we had, Black Hawks with missiles, and then we got the order to stand down. And he said, my friends landed their helicopters in Tajikistan because they didn't want to land in Afghanistan because they'd get hunted down and killed. And so we leave all these weapons over there. And anyway, and then they're infiltrating the drug gangs in South America and coming up across the southern borders. And again, here's little Israel, 9 million people, 400 million Muslims, the majority of which would be happy to be moderate. But when the West shows itself weak, all that's left is the fundamentalist ones that are threatening, and so they're moving in that direction. If Israel was gone, they would just be fighting each other. And so Hassan Youssef, his father started Hamas in 1985, and he ended up becoming a Christian and fleeing to America. I interviewed him one time, and from 1997 to 2007, he had a friend who was captured, and the Hamas tortured him to death. And they said he was helping the Jews, and he goes, he was my friend. I know he was not helping the Jews, and he says, if this is the way the Hamas treats their own people now, imagine if they were in control. And so he would talk about them starving their people on purpose to gain international sympathy so that they could attack the Jews. And the more that they could punish their own people and blame it on the Jews, then the countries like France or whatever would recognize a Palestinian state. And so he would warn the Jews when the Muslims were going to do terrorist attacks for 10 years. And finally he escaped to America, and he would on CBN, and he said, my problem is with the God of the Quran. If we compare his personality to the God of the Bible, we will find the difference. From their fruits, we know them. The fruits of the God of the Quran is terrorism, beating women, killing children. My transformation took 6 years of study. It was not overnight. I had to study Christianity and other religions. I considered at some point not to believe in any religion. The only path I found peace, which was good for me and good for all mankind, was Jesus Christ. I'll end with that. God bless you.
Thank you, sir. Wow. As he was talking, all I can think of is like, man, there's just more than meets the eye, right? Like, just, it's so in depth, and the history of the Islamic faith is puzzling in a lot of areas. And it makes sense going through this. It just makes sense. Yeah. So we're going to transition, but before we do, we are going to, Pastor Terry's going to open up her clothes closet, and so we're going to leave that open for anyone who wants to shop. Free clothes, go for it, all right? And we're going to transition that to our time of for lunch. Amen, lunch. Who's hungry? Glory to God. We love food here. Yes, we do. And so if you have, or if you are signed up to be part of the luncheon here, we will go make a right through those hallways, and the very last door on the left, you can go there to transition to the Gap Central where lunch will be. For the rest of you guys who plan on going out, we ask that you come back by 1 p.m., all right? 1 p.m., give you guys some time, all right? Amen. All right. Enjoy yourselves. Bless you guys.